So let me find the right screen to share. Down here. So I've put the slides up on the VLE and in this chat. So that's what we're looking at today. So I'm going to move into slideshow. Let's go back to the beginning and we're going to play it from start. Can everyone see this? Can you just let me know that you can see it?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So this is the politics of the everyday. So as I said before, this is the session. So we're going to revisit the V&A Museum, and then we're going to look at the political everyday, and then I'm going to give you feedback on questioning the collection. Between 2 and 3, we're going to take a break. Hopefully I'll be able to fit all of this into the session. Otherwise we might go over by a little bit, but I think all 3 of these things are going to be super important for you today. So the first thing I want to start with is this: what's going on at the V&A Museum? So some news came out on Friday, and it developed over the weekend, and it's still going on now, where more news is coming out, in that there has been huge changes proposed to the V&A Museum. I don't know how many of you have followed this news story, have seen it around, but I think it's really important to highlight it as symptomatic of certain things that are happening around history at the moment, and what is commonly being called a culture war. But I think that's a bit of a what would also be called a false flag in this situation. But history at the moment, certainly within the last few months, seems to be becoming deeply politicized. And obviously this is a course around design history and theory, and I am a design historian, so I think it's really important that I bring you this news and talk to you about the implications and what it means for you as practitioners, and also what it means for you as people for whom the V&A Museum was built. Because I really am committed to this idea that the V&A is your museum. So this is the news story that's come out. Do you remember when we did the session on Designers Museum, I showed you the structure of the museum, of how it was structured behind the scenes? So there's Tristram Hunt, who's the director of the V&A. And if you look at how it's structured, right, you have things like the conservation department and the learning department, but you also have like the key departments like sculpture, metalwork, ceramics and glass. Right, these are different departments. You also have furniture, textile and fashion. Can you see those? Yeah. The museum is historically organized around designed goods, right? So it's designed around materials. Because, you know, like if you went to the RCA, for example, because the relationship with the V&A and the Royal College of Art is very strong, they were formed at the same time, you can go to the RCA and do an MA in sculpture, and therefore the sculpture department is like your materials library. For example, there used to be, I think there's still a ceramics course, ceramics and glass course at the RCA as well, that you can go and study ceramics and glass and develop yourself as a practitioner in that sense. Therefore, that collection is your materials library. You can also then go and study fashion, and therefore the fashion department becomes your materials library. So this is structured for practitioners, right? This structure of furniture, textiles, sculpture, metalwork, ceramics. This is structured for you. Now, this is the news that's come out over the weekend. So the V&A is to say goodbye to departments by material, woodwork, metalwork, etc., and 20% of its curators. This is a story that is in the Art newspaper. It's a really good newspaper to read if you want to find out the latest happenings in the art and design world. So Tristram Hunt has said that the government help has not been enough to cover all the costs incurred by the pandemic, and admits curators will be more stretched. This news should come as no surprise to you. The culture industries, as they're called, which includes museums and galleries, have been hit really badly by the pandemic, and there hasn't been enough government support oftentimes to keep them going. One way to understand this is that although museums and galleries are publicly owned, right? So that they're owned by the UK state. They're only partially funded by the UK state. So I'm going to show you some of the kind of funding details. This is the whole story that I put on, but you can have a look at these slides in your own time. So the V&A will undergo a radical restructuring across its curatorial and research departments in order to reduce costs by £10 million by 2023 in the wake of the coronavirus. It will also be cutting dozens of positions across the museum. So they're going to make 140 jobs redundant out of a workforce of 980. So then it gives you a bit of history into this. The mother, as it's called, of decorative art museums, the V&A was called the Museum of Manufacturers, which is the thing that I hope you learnt the other time. And it was aimed to provide manufacturers and craftspeople with examples of good design for them to emulate, which is why its collections have traditionally been divided up by materials for ease of consultation, right? So far, understandable. This is what's happening. The proposed overhaul breaks with this approach by creating 3 period-based departments for the European and American collections. So the European collections and the American collections are going to be merged into one, and then they're going to be divided chronologically. So there's going to be one department that's going to be medieval through to late 18th century. So that's 8 centuries worth of material. Then there's going to be the 19th century to 1918, and then the modern and contemporary, so like the 20th and 21st century. So they're going to add digital art design, etc. This is the killer as well, though. Read this very carefully. Another department will be created that covers sub-Saharan Africa and the African diaspora, art design and performance, and Asian collections. So sub-Saharan Africa and the African diaspora and the Asian collections are going to be merged. As they are merged, there is no proposal to organise them chronologically. Now, for some of you, you might be wondering, why is this a big deal, right? And the V&A is obviously trying to sell this idea. It says it will enable new collaborative ways of working and will strengthen our areas of expertise, blah, blah, blah. That's from the V&A PR department, by the way. Does anyone have any sense of why this is so problematic? Is anyone willing to tell me why this is a problem?
Yeah, well, it's treating the history of Europe and America in a very different way to the way that it's treating the African and Asian history. Firstly, from the fact that, you know, they're merging African and Asian history, which are 2 completely separate parts of the globe that are being kind of umbrellaed just as, like, I guess, other to European, and also the fact that they're not really giving them that same treatment of the scrutiny of different time periods. It's just kind of all being lumped into this one big thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. There are various tropes in this restructuring as well that tie into a hugely colonial imperative that came out of empire, which is that Europe has a history and everywhere else doesn't. Right? The history and the notion of development and progress, for which design is, you know, a really important discourse in design, this notion of progress, it exists in the West. It doesn't exist anywhere else, right? It doesn't exist in Africa. It doesn't exist in Asia. And then, or as you said, like putting them into this huge, like really different cultures, into this huge kind of like pot of just stuff without any kind of organizational structure behind it. And then also the other thing as well is that, you know, this segmenting of Europe and America into one unit, and then everything else is other, right? As if Asia, as we want to call it, in a very kind of expanded and broad sense that I want to call it, has, and African art and design and Asian art and design have had no influence or no interjection with European and American collections, right? As if they're like totally sits outside. So do you remember when we did our very, very first lecture for Histories and Theories, I showed you that Alfred Barr diagram for the Museum of Modern Art? I'm going to put that up again so you can have a look at it. But I think it goes back to that kind of model, that it is very, very Eurocentric, and anything outside of Europe and North America is othered, right? So we're going to carry on looking at this article. This is Hunt talking about the decision and what his vision is, you know, as a leader in this industry. And he says, the indispensable functions of the museum are that they care for the collections, they research into them, and they offer a public program for interpretation and education. So he then talks about the numbers, right? He said, before the pandemic, we had 50,000 paying members, most of them recruited through the exhibitions. And he pointed out that the government only covers 40% of annual running costs. And actually, it's exhibitions, events, merchandising, and sponsorship that gives 60%. So whilst in previous years, there were 4 million visitors, this 2020 only saw 20% of visitors. So they're predicting that it's not till 2024 that they get back. Now, listen, the economic argument is a reality, right? It's a non-negotiable reality. There isn't enough money in the V&A. However, did they have to restructure like this? Like, was this their only option in terms of restructuring? And then also yesterday, the government just announced, I think, 450 million pounds worth of money for the cultural sectors. And Tristram Hunt again came out yesterday and said, yes, this is very good, but it's not enough. And so they're kind of pushing on with this. What is so extraordinary to me is that this is colonizing the museum under a kind of idea of empire that wasn't even in the original plan for the museum. It's almost taking it back before the museum existed into this incredibly problematic structure. This idea has not gone unnoticed, right? So this is Dan Hicks. This is Dan Hicks on Twitter, because lots of this is happening on Twitter because it's very fast. Dan Hicks is a professor of contemporary archaeology at Oxford. He's also curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is amazing. It's an amazing, amazing museum. And he's just got a new book out called The Brutish Museums, which I really, really recommend. So this is his Twitter feed, and I'm including it because I want to show you like the validity of sources. That's a really important thing for you to note, like who is saying what and on what platform, because you need to be able to start judging that as kind of proto-design historians and theorists. So Dan Hicks writes, this opportunistic restructuring of the V&A is a disaster. The V&A was never a historical museum. It's a museum of design. Imposing a chronological structure is an attack upon the very purpose and ethos of the institution. And I have to say, I absolutely agree with him. And then these are some of the replies, right? So I'm going to show you this because this is really interesting because it ties into a broader debate about what is going on around history in the UK at the moment. So this is a reply to that tweet. This is a guy called Jack Davey. So the BM stands for the British Museum. So he says, thinking about this, it clearly marks a broader shift in the nationals. So he means national museums. There has long been an agreement between the V&A and the British Museum not to step on one another's toes by maintaining separate curatorial structures. So the British Museum is structured curatorially in a vastly different way to the V&A because the V&A is a museum of design. Now, this is the bit that I really, really, really love. This includes, for an example, an agreement that the V&A collects carpets and the British Museum collects rugs, and they don't cross over. There was a bit of back and forth over some Afghan conflict carpets or rugs about 10 years ago. For me, when I read a tweet like that, I just think there's a whole research project in there of like the difference between a rug and a carpet and how that difference is then articulated through ideas of national histories or international histories and histories of design. But I just wanted to include that because I found that really funny, this difference between a carpet and a rug. But to go back more seriously, here's some of the commentary that's coming out that I want you to look at. So somebody looking at this proposal and saying, you know, well, Europe and America have a joint history, but Africa and Asia are not connected to that history. You can look at 18th century Chinese porcelain without thinking about Europe. And then someone else has said, how could anyone in a museum consider that medieval European medieval history has more to do with the Americas than Asia and Africa? And somebody's obviously gone in with a hot take about Cecil Rhodes. And then also another idea that comes in here from Jack Davey again, where he says there is no indigenous American material at the V&A to be shoved into other cultures department. It was deaccessioned in a restructure in 1980 and all sent to the Museum of Mankind. So there was a curatorial drive at the V&A around what kind of material it held and what kind of material it gave to other museums, because they were pursuing a different curatorial strategy. This announcement by the V&A is really, really big and has made people incredibly angry and upset. And I'm going to show you why. So this is Dan Hicks from yesterday, I think. So he's talking about the 4 chronological periods of design from medieval to contemporary. They happened in Europe and America and Asia. But on the left, there's an excerpt here from an article from the Daily Telegraph. So there's a man called Oliver Dowden, who's the head of Department Culture, Media and Sports. So he's in charge of like all the museums and everything, and how British culture gets articulated and all kinds of stuff. And there's been some really unpleasant commentary around a project run by a woman called Professor Karina Fowler, who was employed, she's an academic employed by the National Trust to work on a project to look at the links that some of the National Trust properties have to the slave trade. It got taken up by the Daily Mail, who started running the most appalling headlines. She started getting death threats. It's totally out of hand, and it's deeply, deeply upsetting, because she is a historian and she is working on evidence-based research, and this is her job, and it's not a political football that she's picking up and running with. It's part of her work and her long-standing work. In response, Oliver Dowden called a meeting with what were termed as like the leading British like DCMS organisations. And this is from an article in the Daily Telegraph on the left. And it says leaders from the 2 organisations, as well as the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Arts Council England, the National History Museum, the British Museum and the Imperial War Museum will be amongst those present at the meeting. And then it carries on, whilst Mr. Dowden is not opposed to blah, blah, blah. The thing to note in this article from the Daily Telegraph, and it's been run a couple of times, this list of organisations, is that there is no museum in the UK called the National History Museum. We don't have a National History Museum. It just doesn't exist. And this is appearing in the Daily Telegraph. This isn't just a mistake made by the fact checkers and sub-editors at the Daily Telegraph. There is a presumption, I think, that the V&A will be starting to move towards a natural history museum. I think they meant to write the V&A Museum, and it was like a typo that then made it through to this National History Museum. This is really, really problematic. Because now what we have is a university minister, this is another part of the discourse, a woman called Michelle Donnellan, who's a trained historian from York University, saying that any work that is done around decolonisation and looks at like the reading lists we give you, or and I'm really struck by this because I've read like your submissions over the last few days around statues in the UK, and so many of you are looking at these statues through the eyes of the decolonisation movement, through the eyes of Black Lives Matter. Like, this is a really important topic for you as a generation, right? Let alone like the UK society, but you as a generation. And she is saying that this effort at universities to decolonize history is like Soviet Union style censorship. So she claims, with no evidence, that books were being removed from reading lists in an effort to prevent students being forced to confront hate speech. And she said, censoring history like the Soviet Union. And she said, where is it? However, the minister's comments were criticised by historians who suggested she had misunderstood attempts to place subjects such as the British Empire in the context of questions of race and slavery. This university minister talking about the decolonisation of history ties in fundamentally to the restructuring at the V&A Museum. There is a shift towards a very, very old-fashioned, outdated, and I think this is a kickback, if I'm honest. I think this is a cultural kickback against the success of the decolonisation movement, of the Black Lives Matter campaign, and it's deeply, deeply problematic. So I've included the full article here and quotes from her. I've also included the names of 2 historians. So Charlotte Lydia Riley, who's a lecturer in 20th century British history at the University of Southampton. She's a brilliant historian. She's quite frank in her tweets. So she says that this historian is talking out of her arse. She doesn't understand decolonising the curriculum. She doesn't understand the purpose of history, and she seems a bit hazy on the Soviet Union. So she's very much being graded as a 3rd, maybe a fail for her understanding of history as a government minister. And then someone else pointing out that there's no evidence for this. And so I just want you to read this. This article is from The Independent. So I'm going to tell you where all my sources come from so that you can go and check them and understand it from kind of firsthand. So this article is from The Independent. So that's the kind of middle-leaning newspaper, slightly to the left, but not as left as The Guardian. So I want you to read that. So at the moment, this proposal for the restructuring of the V&A is under consultation with the staff, right? Whenever you go through a restructuring and whenever you look to make job losses, the management of that organisation always has to open it up for consultation with the staff so that they get feedback and etc. etc. It's part of a legal process that has to be undertaken. This is your museum. Some of you, you might not be fully engaged with this. This might not be your bag. You might not totally get what's happening, whatever your situation, that's absolutely fine. But this is still your museum. So if you object to this, this is the details of Tristram Hunt, the director at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I've given you like his old school address. I've hunted out, I think that's his email address. I've also put a link to the executive board of the V&A. And if you want to voice your objections as young design students to what is happening at your museum, I would greatly encourage you to do that. If you would like to, you don't have to do it, but I just wanted to present to you what is happening this week. This period of consultation ends at the end of March, and you have an absolute right to make your voice heard within this debate, and to reach out and tell them exactly what you think of this restructuring. I also recommend that you go out and do your own research into this. I've provided you with a top level line of things that I've read and seen, but I really recommend that you dig deeper into the information, more than I presented to you, so you really understand how the changes are going to affect the shape of what we understand design history to be in 10, 15, 20 years time. So that's my little Wednesday morning discussion of what is happening at the V&A Museum. Does that make sense to you all? Has anyone got any comments or feedback for me?
I've got a question.
Yes.
I don't really get how this new structure is going to cut costs. So I don't see the relation between reducing costs and restructuring the whole museum.
Well, that's something, Mahmoud, that you could definitely ask and research into about how they are proposing, because they have to make all their plans public. So there will be information out there somewhere which will tell you how that £10 million will be cut. It will be predominantly cut from salaries. And as far as I understand it, what is happening is a lot of the conservators, so the specialist conservation experts that work with metalwork, fashion, textiles, woodwork, they are going to be made redundant because there's no role for them if there's no department of metalwork.
Okay, thanks.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rex, it does seem like things have gone backwards. And it's almost like they've gone backwards, like beyond the very founding and the purpose of the V&A Museum. It is bad, Cassandra. I do think it is pretty awful. People are really worried about it, not only in terms of what is being proposed at the V&A, but also like how those other discourses around historical research are being undermined in very, very fundamental ways, specifically in higher education, and specifically to do with things like the National Trust or English Heritage. I think I read something this morning where the director of English Heritage, which is a very, very conservative, like it's more conservative than the National Trust. It's a very conservative organisation, but whenever they publish research now, they don't put the researcher's name onto that research because it puts their researchers in danger on social media, that people kind of come after them. It's really, really problematic. It's, you know, like I never thought when I got into the history game that it would be people's safety on the line, right? Their safety and well-being. So this is something to look into if you're interested. But again, I would emphasize to you, this is your museum. If you don't like these changes, you know, like tell someone, tell them, because you're their key audience. Yeah, you absolutely have a right to reach out. So any other comments or questions before I go to the next section? All the slides are on the VLE. The reorganisation of the museum is disgusting. I can't believe things like this still happen, Elisa says. Well, it's not that they still happen. This hasn't happened. This kind of radical restructuring like this into a very nationalistic agenda has never happened in the history of the V&A. This is new. This is very, very new. So this is 170 years into it as an institution, and it's really concerning. I jokingly said to a colleague of mine over the weekend when we were talking about this, that I wouldn't be surprised if at some stage the V&A drops the word design from all its marketing, branding, everything. So that it's no longer a museum of design, that they call it like the National History Museum for Material Culture or something like that. Like design just falls out of it. But it feels like a shift towards that. It's really, really problematic. So on that note, I am going to talk to you now about an exhibition. So let us go back to the slides, because I want to talk to you about the political everyday, and I think that ties into it. So can someone say that they can just see this? Right? Can you see Tristram? Yeah.
I see it.
Okay, so this is actually our session today. It's called The Politics of the Everyday. So bear with me. So to date, we've looked at design, history and theory as icon, as museum, as capital, as national geographies. And whilst these positions are very popular and often dominate popular discourse, maybe today we can rescue design from the evil capitalist clutches of imperialism and ego. Today, we're going to look at design not as a specialist activity and not as one linked to capital per se, but we're going to try and attempt to situate it as an everyday activity, as just another human activity. And in doing so, in pulling it down, so to speak, into the everyday, we're going to look at how it's utilised in questions of everyday politics. This is not politics with a capital P, but it's about the small shifts in power relations. It's of taking power relations and challenging the scripts through design. So, is this how we really understand design? Is this how anyone actually ever practices it? So the first slide I want to talk to you is about the everyday. So what do we mean by the everyday? Well, we mean daily life. And I know in this year that daily life has somehow been upended. It's the routines of life. This isn't about the large moments. This isn't about the births, the deaths, the marriages, so to speak, although those too have an everydayness to them that we often fail to recognise. But it's about getting up in the morning. It's about feeding and clothing the body. It's about the travel to work and school, often from bedroom to study and back again. It's about the normal activities we engage in. It's about the watching of TV, the surfing of the internet, the going to bed, the sleeping. It's about the repetition. It's about the routine. And it's about, quote, normal life. A key aspect of the everyday is the social, not the big interview or the performance, but the small scale social interactions that make up our day, the almost unnoticeable interactions that play such a fundamental role in forming the world we live in. And I'm really interested to read this out from my notes this year that I have for this lecture, because it's those small non-noticeable interactions that we've realized are so important to us. The kind of exchanging of pleasantries in shops, the nodding one's head at one's neighbour when you sees them. So this is a quote that comes out of Ben Highmore, and he says, everyday life may be described as mundane, routine, natural, or habitual. Sometimes it's called normality. Into this arena, we're going to bring the sociologist Ernest Goffman and an excerpt of his book, The Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life. For what Goffman does is he presents a really powerful idea of the everyday, specifically the social. So he wrote a number of books in the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s, I think. But The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life is one of those like key texts. So if you ever get a chance to read it or read an excerpt of it, I'll try and find some chapters of it and put it online for you. It's really, really good. And it will change the way you think about certain things, which is always the sign that something is good if it challenges what you normally think. So Goffman's idea of the everyday, he is really underpinned by a notion of working consensus. So I'm going to read you the quote. So this is what Goffman writes. Together, the participants contribute to a single overall definition of the situation, which involves not so much a real agreement as to what exists, but rather a real agreement as to whose claims concerning what issues will be temporarily honoured. Real agreement will also exist concerning the desirability of avoiding an open conflict of definitions of the situation. One of the reasons why this quote is so interesting, I think, is because it's not about the truth of a situation or the truth of a social interaction, right? But the notion that a real agreement as to what exists, but a real agreement as to whose claims are going to be honoured. It's a very, very sociological interpretation of our interactions with the everyday. It's really not about truth with a capital T, but it's about constant negotiation in all our social interactions. So then what he does is he then goes on to analyze this idea through looking at various relationships, such as the relationship between a waitress and a customer, or the teacher and a student. And then he also looks at, and this is obviously a trope within this course, he also looks at the relationship between a patient in a mental health institution and the attendant who works there. So here are some examples of those that I've got off like stock photos, like the archetypal waitress or the archetypal teacher. So his claim is this: society is organized on the principle that any individual who possesses certain social characteristics has and this is really important, a moral right to expect that others will value and treat him in an appropriate way. Connected with this principle is a second, namely that an individual who implicitly or explicitly signifies that he has certain social characteristics ought in fact to be what he claims he is. So think about that, for example, with me, right? As your teacher, as your educator, I assume the moral right as your teacher to be your teacher, and you kind of give me that right. We've already gone through a process of non-verbal agreement that I will perform this role and you will perform the role of the student, and that this is almost an element of morality, and that I expect you to treat me in an appropriate way as you would do with a teacher, and that you have a certain expectation about how you will treat me as your teacher. And then also this idea that I am who I say I am, right? That I'm employed at Goldsmiths and therefore I must be a teacher. I'm Dr. Juliet Christensen. I must be qualified to do this and have studied to do this. In truth, I could be a massive con artist. I'd be very good if I could maintain this level way beyond my skills and capability, I have to be honest, but I could be. But we just make the assumption that I'm your teacher and this is how this works. So what we're talking about here is an idea of social identity, right? And we're talking about social identity as a matter of performance. And when Goffman talks about this idea of social identity as performance, he's not talking about it metaphorically. This is a very, very old idea, right? Very famously, William Shakespeare, As You Like It, Scene 2, Act 2, Scene 7, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. This is what happens when sociologists take Shakespeare seriously, right? He's taken this incredibly seriously and looked at this thing in terms of sociology, in terms of taking this line of identity as performance. And what's so interesting with Goffman is this isn't just a superficial move that he makes. He takes the whole of dramaturgy. He takes the whole of the arts of theatre and places them within a sociological context. So he's really interested in like the architecture of theatres. He's really interested in the architectures of everyday life. And that's why he kind of makes links between the two things. So we can see another move that Goffman makes in his work is he talks about scripts. And he says, you know, in an everyday we will perform a variety of different roles, right? So take, for example, me, I have children, so I perform the role of parent. I also perform the role of mother, which is a very different kind of role. I'm a professional woman, so I perform the role of employee to my boss. I'm your teacher, I perform that role. I also shop in the supermarket, so I perform the role of customer or client. There are all many, I have friends, you'll be glad to hear. I also perform the role of friend, and we slip through these different movements. This isn't to say none of them are me, or that there is no such thing as me, but I perform these different roles and behaviors, and they have different scripts attached to them. So, and often these are social scripts that we learn when we're very young, and we perform them almost subconsciously. We perform them in social situations. And depending on a social situation, we can perform many different social scripts within one day. But it's not just about the script of social life, it's also about the stage on which we perform, that the script that we perform has to be performed in the right theatre on the right stage. And here a really interesting kind of language shift is, I don't know if any of you read any kind of theory about war or histories of war or anything like this, but in warfare, when military officers and politicians are like engaged in conflict and war, they often talk about different warring regions as being different theatres. So they'll talk about like the Afghan theatre, or they'll talk about the African theatre. And what they mean is a theatre in which a war is played out. I find that move super interesting. I'm sure there's another research project there. But it's not just about the theatres and the stages, it's also about the objects. It's about the things around us which we use as props to guide our performances. So here, there's a really amazing quote by a man whose surname I can never pronounce, but I'm going to try and give it a go. His name's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, I think. He wrote an amazing book about flow. I can actually spell his name, but I can't say it. But he is absolutely, he's a brilliant theorist. And he talks about objects in this way. He says, objects do not create order in the viewer's mind by embodying principles of visual order. They do so by helping the viewer struggle of the ordering of his own or her own experience. A person finds meaning in objects that are plausible, concrete symbols of the foremost goals, the most salient actions and events in people's lives. That's the quote. So I'm going to go over it again because I think it's really important. So here, for example, on the left, I've got a picture of David Tennant playing Hamlet, and he's holding supposedly the skull of his father. It's a very famous scene in Shakespeare's play, The Hamlet. And I think that's really important. I think this is a great image to explain what Mihai is talking about in design and order in everyday life. So he's saying a person finds meaning in objects that are plausible, concrete symbols of the foremost goals, the most salient actions and events in that person's life. So Hamlet is in deep mourning for his father, and then he absolutely kind of puts his energy and effort into this kind of found skull and talks to him as if his father were there, and etc., etc. This is a very clear example of that. Another really clear example of Goffman, which I think is really useful for us as designers, is this idea of the front stage and the backstage. This is really important for Goffman. He says we have the front stage where we place dramatic interaction, and the backstage where some might say the real action happens. So the props, the signs, the give-offs, the gives, they're all at the front, and at the backstage is the informal talk and the relaxed roles. So you can also think of this in terms of like your education, that we as teachers come out, we talk to you, we tutor you, we do all this work that performs in front of you, the front stage. What you don't see are all the conversations and meetings that we have behind the scenes to make sure that you have a front stage experience that we think is something that we think is called an education. And one can call that impression management. It's been kind of picked up by PR in certain kinds of ways, but this idea of the front stage and backstage, what are you seeing at the front and what is happening behind the scenes in order to set that up? That's a really important idea for us in design. So, for example, a scene like this is not unusual. This is hopefully what we're going to be like next year once we've all been vaccinated, and I will be standing in front of you in a lecture theatre room. And this idea of the front and backstage will become very, very clear when we're in physical space together. This idea of the front and backstage fits into the design world in numerous ways. One of the clearest ways it fits in is within a practice of design called service design. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the kind of field that is service design. It's very, very commercially based, but it has this idea of the front stage, which is directly from Goffman, visible to customers, and then the backstage, invisible to customers. And then you have things in this like the user journey or the customer journey, or what are called channels or touch points. And then in the back, you have products and service blueprints. If you're a service designer, you can work in each of these sections, or you can work across the whole thing. It's a really interesting, it's very, 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 very commercial, but it's very, very interesting to watch Goffman's work kind of in process. So what they're trying to do is work out what is the customer experience and how the organization and the company needs to structure itself and what it needs to do in order to meet its customers' needs, right? So it's trying to link up this. The reason I'm telling you this story is because of this, the Apple store. You'll all probably recognize this. Most of you have probably been in an Apple store. And I just want to talk to you about a history of these spaces. I've worked on Apple for a number of years, since I think 2004 or 5. So I've watched the rise of these stores over the years with deep interest, and really interested in the history of how they came about and how they make a different proposition to the market in terms of customer experience, etc. So in the year 2000, the company Apple decided to explore setting up a retail space. Previous to this, before 2000, you could only buy Apple products through third-party retailers. Right, and it was specialist for education and design. It wasn't a mass market product at all. Apple wasn't a mass market company. It was very, very specialist, and you had to go through third parties in order to buy it, a product from the Apple range. What Steve Jobs did is he appointed a man called Mickey Drexler who previously worked at Gap, and he hired him to lead the concept of like what a retail store for Apple would look like and how it would operate. And the first piece of advice that Drexler gave was to prototype the store. So he said to Jobs, you have to prototype your retail environment, not design it and build it, which is what nearly all retailers do. He said you have to take the ethos of Apple, the design ethos, and design it like it would one of its products. So what they did at Apple is they rented a warehouse. I think it was in Arizona, but they rented a big warehouse, and inside it, they built a shop. And the story goes, and this may be apocryphal, but the story goes, they got it absolutely wrong the first time they built it. They organized the shop around the divisions in the company, not by how a potential consumer would understand their products. And they tested it, and it was a huge disaster. So they went back to the drawing board, and they spent another 6 to 9 months redesigning the shop. 6 to 9 months in a retail environment is huge, you know, like you live and die on it. They spent so much money researching and prototyping the shop before they opened even one. So one of the crucial parts of the process was understanding their customer. So what they did is they brought together broad groups of people to talk about their experience of customer service. So you could almost think of this like focus groups, right? And they ran numerous focus groups around customer service specifically. And in talking to these people, it became clear that actually what Apple needed to do, the most popular form of customer service was a hotel lobby. Everyone found the space of a hotel lobby to have the highest customer service in it. So the idea that you were at a high-end hotel like the Four Seasons or something like this, or the Waldorf, or I don't know, Claridge's, or you were in one of those spaces, very, very high-end hotels, and you were in the lobby, and the customer service was always identified as being above and beyond. That is how the Apple Store came about. They designed the Apple Store to be like a hotel lobby. So, for example, the Genius Bar is meant to almost represent like the reception of a hotel, that you can go in and ask any questions about what's going on. So what Apple were doing then was exactly what Goffman speaks about. They were looking at the front stage, the experience of the customer, and then the backstage of how the company needed to restructure its business behind the scenes. So they did do a company restructure in order to then meet the customer needs as they understood it. So here's the inside of an Apple Store. In the short term, this was hugely, hugely expensive, but in the medium to long term, it's been unbelievably successful for them, this strategy and the design of their retail environments. So I've got some old figures from like when they've almost first opened, like right at the beginning. So if we go to New York and we go to the Fifth Avenue stores alone, so Fifth Avenue in New York has got some of the most expensive retail properties on that street in the world. In 2007, store Saks, which is a very high-end department store on Fifth Avenue, was generating $362 per square foot a year, right? That's the kind of profit level. Tiffany's, the jewelers, very famous, Tiffany's on Fifth Avenue, was making $2,666 a year per square foot, right? So different scale, making a lot more money. But Apple was clearing $4,000 per square foot. It was more successful than Saks and Tiffany's. And this price of $4,000 per square foot was just the average of its then 174 stores, i.e. half of its stores made more money than that per square foot, right? So this has been a hugely successful strategy for them. Let's go back to boring though. What are the problems, though, of this kind of idea of the everyday? I've taken us down a particular path. I'm now going to pull us back to the beginning and ask us about the everyday and just think about how problematic the everyday can be. Well, perhaps the most prominent and the largest problem of the idea of the everyday is the very concept of normal. What is normal to one person is going to be very, very different to another. Indeed, we can think of situations where the opposite of one person's normal is to another normal. Extreme wealth and extreme poverty, for example, both construct a different sense of normal. What is interesting then about the normal or the everyday is that it seems to lack an openness to moral judgment. Indeed, the construction of the discourse of the normal would seem to contain at its very root a locking out of any sense of judgment on behalf of a third party. So then normal becomes, in a sense, a term of anthropology as the centre of an ethnographic approach. And in situating it like this, it calls for the neutrality of the observer. So I'm just going to unpack that a little bit because I know those ideas are quite dense. This idea of normal, if somebody does something in their everyday life, which is very different to what you do, and you might even think it's not acceptable. It might not be morally acceptable. It might not be ethically acceptable. But to that person, it's simply how they live their lives. And it's incredibly everyday to them. And you say to them, this thing that you're doing, like, let's try and find a ridiculous example. Okay, I've got a really ridiculous example, so bear with me. Somebody who gets a knife to butter toast or margarine, put butter or toast on margarine, and then after they've buttered the toast, licks the knife, which I find abhorrent, right? Like in terms of like etiquette or whatever, but you know, like, but for somebody else, that could be entirely normal behavior. Like that's just what they do. They lick the knife after they've buttered a piece of toast. And you say to them, what are you doing? That's disgusting. Don't do that. Like, why are you licking the knife after buttering a piece of toast? And they say, well, it's just what I've always done. It's just like I always do this. And this sense of like, well, this is just my normal, it seems to not let in any kind of moral judgment. Because again, we're back into this battling of whose normal are we talking about? Is it right that I have these rules around like knives and buttering toast, or am I like, is my normal out of kilter and actually I've got it all wrong and this other person's sense of normal is right? Like it comes into ideas of kind of moral relativism, which are super interesting to explore. And in making these kind of judgments about whose normal counts under what conditions, there's the assumption that the person or the researcher, say me, is somehow neutral, right? That if I'm observing an interaction between two people arguing about whether licking a knife covered in butter after buttering a piece of toast is normal, there's a kind of understanding that I, as a researcher, have to be morally neutral on this because I need to be observing this interaction. So this is why the everyday becomes deeply political. It's like whose voice is heard under what kinds of conditions. So here we have, for example, a normal distribution curve, which I just wanted to show you. Often when we talk about things to do with normal, we're mentally looking at a normal distribution curve, which is a kind of mathematical model of the normal. For the design theorist, Ben Highmore, questions of whose everyday life lies at the heart of the issue in terms of his interest in whose everyday life are purposefully ignored is of central role to his practice. Indeed, we could say that Goffman's idea of the working consensus effectively locks down a highly individuated sense of normal that is itself privileged. And so much so that Highmore goes on to argue this. So Highmore wrote this amazing book called Questioning Everyday Life. I really recommend reading it if you're interested in this topic. So he says, to invoke the everyday can often be a sleight of hand that normalizes and universalizes particular values and specific worldviews. Claiming everyday life as self-evident and readily accessible becomes an operation for asserting dominance of specific cultures and for particular understandings of such cultures. So this quote in and of itself within the context of this lecture is really, really interesting, but it's also really interesting in terms of what I talked to you about at the beginning to do with the V&A and the structure of history. There will be a sense in which that argument is presented as, well, of course it's like this, it has to be, this is just the normal way that history is done, which is being presented by people on the right who are practicing historians, and this idea that it's self-evident, and it's a methodology for asserting dominance of a specific culture and a specific understanding of such a culture. So for Highmore, the call to the everyday is the call not only to histories from below, right, as it's called, like history from the underneath, so women, BME histories, the disenfranchised, the poor, the working class, but also to pay attention not only to the official institutionalized histories and theories, but also to those locked away, the experiences of life which lie backstage, what Highmore calls making the invisible visible. So I'm just going to unpack that a little bit, because I think there's a point here to be made about our pandemic lives, which is that us being at home all the time, and stuck in one space, a lot of people have lived their lives like this for a very, very, very long time, specifically people with chronic illnesses who can't leave home, who have debilitating conditions. You know, like the way that we're living now is the way that some people in our society have always lived. And so this is the process of making the invisible visible. Another facet that any study of the everyday needs to pay attention to, needs to bear in mind, is the balance between difference and commonality, right? This is what Highmore specifically argues for. And in this call, the everyday regains its relativism, not the absolutism of the so-called objective observer, but understanding one's own position in relation to those everyday lives that we are looking to study. So, for example, if you go out and work with a community of people, say, for example, when your brief For the Love Of, where you had to go and like engage with a group of people who are really interested in an activity, you weren't neutral observers of their everyday life. You came into their community with your own preconceptions, understandings, biases. And so the role of the researcher in that field is to be sensitive to your own position in relationship to those people that you are looking at, and to understand how your worldview is occluding or making certain assumptions about other people that maybe you're not justified to make. I think this notion of the history from the underneath is also really, really important for the now, and lots of people are working on this idea at the moment. So how does, hang on, this slide is super good actually. I think we need to come back to this. On the left, we have the everyday. On the right, we have the kind of superstructural structures from like Foucault, right? So do you remember right at the beginning of this course, I talked to you about prisons, and I talked to you about Foucault, and on the right is really a kind of Foucauldian analysis of the world. It looks at the general, it looks at how things are structured, it looks at institutions and discourses, it looks at how power is distributed, and it does macro analysis, right? So for example, if we think of the history of mental health institutions, then we could well be looking at the right-hand side of this, right? If we were looking to do a study of mental health institutions, how they've been designed, how they take care of people who are within their walls, for example, we'd be looking at the right-hand side. On the left is this notion of the everyday, is this kind of Ben Highmore understanding of the everyday. It's about the particular, and it's about agency, it's about the individual in that sense, and it's about their experiences and feelings. It's also about resistances, and it's a micro-analysis. So you get these two different kind of modalities of understanding the world, which I think as first years might be super useful for you to start playing with, to think about the notion of the everyday as the particular, and the Foucauldian analysis and the notion of kind of structure and discourse in a much broader sense. I'm going to come back to this because I think it's a really useful slide for you. So how does design intersect with this concept of the everyday in terms of social and political change? So one of the clearest examples in recent years of the notion of the everyday in design was this exhibition at the V&A held in 2013-14. Actually, it says 2014-15. This exhibition was held under the remit of the previous director of the V&A, Martin Raw, I think his name was, and he was very, 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 very kind of politically engaged, and he sort of commissioned this exhibition. Under Tristram Hunt, it becomes very, very difficult to understand that this exhibition could ever happen within the now, and this is the kind of difference between where we were then and where we are now. It's called Disobedient Objects. Contrary to lots of the exhibits at the museum, this exhibition brought together the results not only of, or the outcomes not only of professionally trained designers, and there were examples in here by professionally trained designers, but also objects which were made to exert what the curators called counter power. And in staging this exhibition, the aim was to produce a people's history of art and design from the below. So this isn't identifying the big design name and saying we're going to include this object that's been designed by Google, or we're going to have this object that's been designed by Terence Conran. This was about your aunt who went to Greenham Common and protested against nuclear disarmament and made a banner, and it was the inclusion of her banner in this. It's a fascinating exhibition because it's just everyday items that are made by people in their everyday lives as a form of protest and political activism. This, for example, was in the exhibition. It was a flyer that was how to use a shopping trolley for protest. Incredibly, the person who designed this kind of graphic, it was for an anti-G8 camp that was at Glen Eagles in Scotland in 2005. Her name is Izzy Morgan Muffle, and she details how you can use a shopping trolley in your protests. So she says she documents redesigned practices of shopping trolleys that occurred at an anti-G8 camp at the Eco Village in Glen Eagles in Scotland. And she writes, nearly as useful as gaffer tape. During the G8, resourceful protesters displayed the many uses of the humble shopping trolley: transport for kitchens, veg wash, instant barricade, barbecues, battering rams, brick transport, and collection, kids entertainment. So this was one of the exhibits within the V&A under disobedient objects. Here's another example. This is a collection of pamphlets from a press called Unpopular Books. And then on the right, you have a selection of protest badges around the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s. You know, all kind of handmade badges and flyers and things like that. Unpopular Books are super interesting, set up in the late 70s by a man called Fabian Tomset in London. And it was part of what was called the cooperative press movement of the period. And it was undoubtedly and unashamedly a communist publishing project. So the pamphlet was the press's preferred medium, being not too short but not too long, but long enough to make an argument. And this was part of the Disobedient Objects exhibition, where they showed these kind of things. There were also protest signs, which are kind of amazing. And just look at like the kind of material aesthetics of these protest signs. This is literally a piece of cardboard, ravaged. You know, it's not pristine, you can see the folds in it, and someone scribbled on it. Like, this isn't neat bubble writing, this isn't kind of fine graphic design, this is someone ripping something and writing a slogan on it. And then also on the right hand side, I wish my boyfriend was as dirty as your policies, you know, protesting climate change. And again, we can see the very kind of handmade nature of it. You can see that like it's kind of peeling, there are a couple of staples on it. Somebody hasn't quite spaced, the boyfriend was properly on the spacer, was ends up kind of squashed. that kind of handmade nature of it. This is very, very different to a kind of refined design aesthetic. And these were exhibited at the V&A. This is perhaps my favorite. Inflatable cobblestones. So these were used in Barcelona in Spain. I'm going to read you a little bit of text from the group of activists who designed and made these inflatable cobblestones, because it's rather brilliant. Protecting protesters from police and causing no damage, an enormous inflatable cube that reflects light. The objective, to impede charging riot police and prevent them from recording images. The Reflecto cube has already been used throughout Europe. You can find DIY tutorials for making them online. This is a secret weapon of tactical frivolity. They transform a protest in a highly interactive and playful event. They make it hard to control, and at the same time, they can physically protect people from the police baton. And so this idea of this object disrupting a particular social script, I think, is really interesting for us. So when you're on a protest and you have police like this, riot police in front of you, faceless, you don't know their names, like dressed full military gear, and you're a protester, there is a social script in place about how you treat one another. And you might have seen with what's happening in Myanmar at the moment, lots of protests also in Russia as well, this kind of social script playing itself out. And the introduction of an inflatable cobblestone, actually what that does is the protesters throw it at the police riot, the riot police, and there are like images and films of the riot police catching it and throwing it back to the protesters. And in this act, there's a sense of the disruption of the normal social script of protest, which I find to be incredibly beautiful. Just this one simple object, and suddenly the whole mood of a group of people can change. And here again, these are some of the how-to guides. So instead of, there was obviously an exhibition catalogue, but alongside the exhibition catalogue, the curators also produced these one-page tear-off sheets where it showed you how you could make a tear gas mask, how you could have a lock-on device for protests, and also gave you a kind of clandestine Syrian stencil. And the V&A produced these branded objects. You can see the V&A brand at the bottom, and it's all about empowering you as a visitor and educating you as a visitor on how to do this. And then also, I know I've mentioned this to you before, but at the same period, saw the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and a large portion of which was at that time centered around Mike Brown and the protests in Ferguson. And what the curators found in looking at the data analytics of who was downloading the digital versions of their how-to guides was that protesters in Ferguson were downloading them and using them in their protests. They were making them live. What's so interesting for us in considering this now with what I said at the beginning, but also thinking about the role and purpose of a museum and the V&A, is how does this situate the V&A, like in this period in time? And how does a museum, which does rest essentially on imperialist roots, and that operates in a globalized and capitalized world, how does this fit into that? And I'm going to leave those questions with you. I've got 2 more slides and then I'm going to take some questions. The other thing also to note that I want to show you about, I know you've just made zines, I think, for your philosophy and design, but I just want to talk to you about kind of feminist publications a little bit. I don't know if any of you ever got these magazines. Specifically the women on this call, when you were girls, whether you saw these kind of images, Cosmo Girl on the left, for example, and then this kind of Barbie and Girls World, this presentation of essentially a very white, thin feminism, and also this kind of, yeah, they're deeply problematic publications in all kinds of different ways, but these kind of publications as a way of shaping an idea in young girls about what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a young girl. This is an area that explores this tension. I mean, I want to show you these really. These are zines that kind of came out in the 80s. sometimes the 70s and 80s. I put a couple of readings up there about feminist zines for you to have a look at. But zines were a way that some young girls who saw these publications and saw what was expected of them as a kind of social identity and wholesalely rejected those identities, they turned to zines as a way to make their own cultural worlds. So we have Teenage Gang Debs. So this was published by a young woman called Erin Smith. And she, in 1991, she was the first generation in the Riot Girl brand Bratmobile. So this magazine is actually published in 1989. And then we have, what do we have? We have Bratmobile. I've got some notes here on Bratmobile. Bratmobile was formed when University of Oregon students Alison Wolfe and Molly Newman collaborated on the feminist fanzine Girl Germs. So this idea about like taking over the mode of production yourself. If you don't like the culture that is being made to you and communicated to you, take it on yourself and make your own culture. And this is very much what these young teenage girls did, certainly in the States and here in the UK. This is from one of the articles that I've put online, and I just wanted to kind of share this quote with you towards the end. So zines are many people's first contact with the idea of a do-it-yourself ethic. I know it was true for me. It's quite staggering the first time you truly digest the revolutionary concept that you don't have to depend on other people to do the things you want to do. You can have full power over that. For me, this zine was my first time being the final critic of my work before it was seen in public. Always in my life, I handed in my writing to teachers, parents, older writer friends to give me their opinions about what I'd done. Suddenly, all this seemed unnecessary. The confidence people gain from this tremendous self-sufficiency can carry over into all aspects of their lives. This is particularly important to kids, girls, minorities, anyone who is discouraged from taking charge in their own lives. So this is zine making as a form of resistance, and it's a quote from one of the zine makers, and I've put that in your reading for today if you're interested in reading zine making as a form of resistance. And I think there's one more slide. So this is how I'm going to kind of end today. I'm going to leave you with these questions and these lists. So these are the two lists about the everyday and the kind of Foucauldian analysis as well, the particular and the general, agency versus structure, experience and feelings versus institutions and discourses, resistance versus power, the micro versus the macro. And so the questions I want to leave you with, which don't have to be answered now, but you can go away and sit with for a while, is, does the everyday provide the training ground for conformity, or is it the place where conformity is evaded? And on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and say, okay, Ellen, you used to get Girl Talk every week as a free gift. Yeah, I'm going to go back over the chat. So does that make sense to you, what I've presented, the notion of the everyday and the kind of politics of it? My sister eats ketchup with a spoon. And I think that is honestly the title of your memoir. I think that has to be the title of your memoir. Wasn't there a guy that ate the plane? This is brilliant. I like your chat. Licking knives. Okay. I'm going to go over it. Okay, I'm going to answer your questions. Caleb, feels so far away and almost wrong to see lectures in person like that. It does. I know what you mean. Elizabeth, is that like UI UX design? Yes, it is. Service design sits within UI UX design sits kind of within service design. It's about interfaces and user experience. Would you accept that behavior if it's jam or Marmite? Strangely, I would accept that behavior if it was peanut butter. Very specific. I have some strong feelings about Marmite, and I don't believe that you should put sweet things on toast, but that's very much like my taste and my everyday. I agree that just eating butter by itself is weird. Licking knives. I know a guy who eats a block of butter like a chocolate bar. Okay, I'm going to have to move on from that comment. What's the difference if it's a knife versus a spoon? Exactly. Like, who's normal are we talking about here? A guy who eats lard. Because the knife could cut your tongue. Ellen, good, sensible point. Wasn't there a guy who ate a plane? Yeah. Yeah, it's going too far. Yeah, your sister eats ketchup with a spoon. I don't think you should be talking to your sister again. I think Granite. Okay, you've got way onto this eating the knife and not the kind of fundamentals of the notion of everyday. Licking the knife and then putting it straight back in the cutlery drawer. Is that like that's for you, Florence, is just an absolute no-no? Okay. But this idea of the everyday is something that I really want you to pay attention to. And also this proposition that design is not this specialist activity, it is just something we do, and that it has been given like this gilded wings, and now it becomes this subject that you study at university. I think that's a really interesting idea as part of this course for you to think about in relationship to the proposition that design is capital, or design is about nationalisms, or design is about icons. Like, what happens if we go back and just say, well, design's just about the everyday, and it's about the political everyday, and it's about agency and taking back control in a kind of non-MAGA kind of way, but like having some agency in one's own life. So those are the propositions I would like to leave you with. Does anyone have any questions for me? Anyone? Anyone? No? Okay, in that case, we're going to take, I'm going to take a 15-minute break. So 12:35, we're going to come back here, and I'm going to go over some of the feedback that I've got for you for your second kind of piece of writing that you've done. Okay, so 12:35, we'll meet back right here. See you in a minute. Hello, everybody. We're going to come back.
Hello.
Hello, Lynn. Was that okay, Lynn?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. Yes, absolutely.
Good.
Hi.
Hello there. Who was that?
Flo.
Hi, Florence. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. Thanks. How are you?
Did that make sense? I feel like I delivered something quite fast and furious at you.
No, that was good.
Yeah?
Yeah, it was really interesting.
I like the inflatable cobblestone. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to start again. So I've read the submissions and I want to just say thank you for all your work on this. It was really, really good to read what you're writing about, and I appreciate that you had competing deadlines. So for those of you who did it, that's great. For those of you who didn't do it, that's fine too. You've still got plenty of time. So hopefully what I can present to you will give you some tips and tricks. Also, it gave me a real insight into things that you care about and things that you think as first year design students, things that matter to you. And one of the key things that came out amongst your cohort was the links that Britain has to the slave trade, the decolonization movement, what are public statues doing, who are we commemorating, and in what kinds of ways. So it was really good for me to read that, to understand you a bit better and about what you're interested in, because that obviously helps us shape what we teach you. So I want to thank you, first of all. What I've done is I've gone through the submissions and I've picked out little bits and pieces, and nothing has got anyone's name on it specifically, but there is a document with all your work on it now that you can go and read what each other is doing. And I think going back to something that I said to you a while ago is, you know, you share your studio practice with one another. You share kind of methods and processes, you share your technical studies, but strangely writing seems to be one of those things that people are a bit scared of sharing. And I just want to encourage you that you're a really great cohort and you should be sharing your written work with one another, because ultimately it's going to make you all better writers and communicators if if you're reading lots of things that your classmates are producing. So I just want to really encourage you to share with one another and to read what one another is doing, because you're great. And I learned a lot from reading your work, and I'm sure everyone else can learn a lot as well. So I'm going to share my screen now, and if someone could just say that they can see it. Hang on a second. Can you see?
I can see it.
You can see it. This is very great news. Yep. Thank you very much. So, institutional knowledge, feedback summary. So, this is my feedback for you. These are tips and tricks and things that I always look out for when I'm reading work. So, first of all, you submitted to me a huge range of statues and monuments. I've done some grabs here of the kind of works that you were looking at. We have, the kind of main big headline sculptures and monuments, such as the Eros or not the Eros statue in Piccadilly, Nelson's Column, the Lions, Boadicea over in South Kensington, Oscar Wilde. But we also have other statues as well, and monuments. So we have the Princess Diana Memorial here, or Robin Hood in Nottingham. So you found lots of great examples of statues and monuments in public spaces. So that was super nice to see the variety. I think very few of you wrote about the same object. So that was also really interesting to see. So my first bit of feedback is about feelings and belief. So I've included in this an image of one of these evangelical pastors that is a big Trump supporter and blesses him on numerous occasions. And I just want to talk to you about what it means to write at a university level and the way that we express ourselves through writing and finding one's voice. So for me, a little bit of a red flag actually is when someone writes a sentence that begins with the words "I think" or "I believe" for a university project. University work, and we are in the age of post-Trump, so let's embrace that world with both hands. It has to be an evidence-based argument. And when you say things like "I think" and "I believe," and you don't produce evidence to back up those thoughts and beliefs, that for me is a problem because of this. I believe in purple unicorns. You don't believe in purple unicorns, but if I just say to you, I believe in purple unicorns enough without producing any evidence, then my view is totally valid. That's not how knowledge works in this kind of way that we are circulating knowledge and the way that we are producing knowledge within higher education. I really need to show you examples of like purple unicorns in, I don't know, graphic novels or on toys or something to show you that I mean that they exist as representations in the world. You know, it's that kind of idea. So the claim, if you start a sentence with "I think" or "I believe," I strongly recommend that when you go back and edit your work, you just cross out the words "I think" and "I believe." You leave it as a statement and you evidence it with a citation, right? That is my kind of hot take. So no, I think, I believe, because those positions don't do anything to advance knowledge unless you produce evidence with which to support it. So we're going to look at that a little bit more as I carry on. What do I mean by evidence? Because that's the big question, isn't it? What is evidence? So this is just a slide to remind you to support your ideas, arguments, propositions with evidence. So I've used like an evidence board from, I think this is from the amazing TV series, The Wire. I was going to choose like a crime scene investigation image, but I think this is much better because there are little snippets of evidence here, maps, news stories, photographs. It's those kind of things that I want you to think of when you're building an argument, when you're writing a piece of work, like support this with evidence. Next point. Opening's voice. Some of you, when you opened your piece of writing, it was just so beautiful, right? So I'm going to highlight this one, Tony, right, which is the best name for a submission I've come across in years. Slap bang in the middle of one of the worst cases of 1960s urban planning in Cambridge is a humble water fountain monument dedicated to Tony. Immediately when I read that sentence, I went, I need to read this entire thing probably 3 times because this has captured me as a reader. You have to think when you're writing that you have a reader, and that reader for this piece of work is going to be me and Toby and maybe a couple of other people, but it's predominantly me and Toby. So like, get our attention, like make a position, like talk to me about Tony and the humble water fountain. Immediately I love that. Another opening that I really, really loved was this. It was super descriptive, but there was a kind of pathos to it that I was really engaged by. So I'm going to read it to you. He stands in between the Old Naval College and the Trafalgar Tavern, a little taller than me, but we have the same shoe size 6. The bronze was lifelike, purposeful creases and textures on his clothes and skin, no right hand, 2 eyes open, 6 badges along his chest. He looks relaxed in his stance and expression. There is a slight bend in his leg, and his hand is resting on his sword. His gaze goes far across the Thames, and his mouth is closed and straight. I stopped here when I was writing these notes because I began to notice and question something different. How does the audience read this statue? And this piece of writing I really, really loved because it engaged me again as a reader. I felt I was standing next to the writer as the writer was looking at this statue, and that the writer was almost speaking to me and just making observations. And the observations weren't like cold and formulaic and about just pure form. There was a kind of reading of the statue of saying he looks relaxed in his stance because he's got a bend in his leg and his hand is resting on his sword. So they're making kind of suppositions, but this for me was also a really lovely piece of writing. So I just wanted to show you these examples to give you a sense of what you can experiment and play with. And here's another one from somebody who looked at the Trafalgar Square lions. So much like Es Devlin, they started writing, when I look at the Trafalgar Square lions, I immediately think of all they have witnessed since being placed in the square in 1867. How many protests, events and wars have happened at their feet? How many locals, couples, children and tourists have climbed upon them? It's strange to imagine that something so iconic, so grounded in London's history, has once been a work in progress. And already there's an evocation there. And there's also a kind of patination with language. How many, like there's a repetition, there's a kind of poetry to the writing, which is really engaging to read. So, you know, as much as I'm saying, don't write, I feel and I believe, this is a different way of like putting yourself into your writing, of bringing me as your reader along with you on a journey. And so I'd really encourage you to do that. But I just wanted to bring out these 3 examples of like different ways that people opened their piece of writing, and ways that I found to be really effective as a mode. So you can be, you know, it doesn't have to be dry. You can write with warmth and for a reader. So you can use I statements. And the most important thing is to write as you and develop a writing voice. Although I've noted this is mainly achieved through practice. And you can draw in your reader with a strong opening, like grab us by the throat, like say, look at this, I find this really interesting. And you can do that in all kinds of different ways. This is now your 3rd piece of, no, this will be your 3rd kind of piece of assessment for context. So it's your 3rd piece of writing. This is such early days for you. You can just experiment and try things out. I just want to encourage you to develop your own voice and to be yourself, because that's the most important person that you can be in this. The one thing I would steer you very, very clear of is the rhetorical question. So I pulled out these 2 examples of this. So I'm just going to read some. So what message is conveyed? Maybe that art is accessible to anyone curious enough, or perhaps it is a reminder that no matter how many museums you visit, there will always be art somewhere in this world forgotten and unknown. Or in this piece, if it is put up by the government, then for what reason they put this up after 30 years this happened? To let people think they really care about this incident? If not, it just shows how they do not even care about it until recent governments. To manifest, does the previous government really care about racial equality? Some of these questions are rhetorical, and I would really advise you not to pose rhetorical questions. You only have 500 words, and rhetorical questions as a kind of semantic device are kind of on the side of the polemic, right? The people use them to try and persuade through asking the reader a rhetorical question to which they already know the answer to, and so it's not really direct. And I'm always really hesitant of them, rhetorical questions in writing at a university level, and just generally in writing at all, actually, if I'm honest. So what I would recommend you do is the following. If you ask a question, answer it. Like if you ask a rhetorical question, then answer it. Or, and this is the much better technique, turn the rhetorical question into a statement or a claim. Often people ask rhetorical questions because they're hesitant about making a statement or claim. So they put them as a rhetorical question to kind of lift the load off a bit, as if they're not really making a statement or claim, but you really, really are. So I would say, just make the statement or claim, like be direct, like tell me what you think, be bold. So that goes on to this, which is karate kick advice. Be declarative, be bold, take the territory. If you've got something to say it directly. Support it with evidence, but say it directly. Like don't kind of sidestep it or dance around it through using rhetorical questions. Just tell me what you think, right? Directly, honestly, truly. Because that is much better writing. Comment number 4. Right, this is something I saw in a number of people's work, which I have to be honest, I haven't really seen in a cohort writing before for this course, which is you're using your practice within your writing, and I really, really, really love it. So, for example, this at the bottom is a statue to dog, and it's like a water fountain for a dog. I think this is Tony. And what somebody did when they visited it, can you see that there's water in it and the ice froze, and they took the ice out and laid it on the ground and took a photograph of it. I don't know what the meaning of that is, but to see that in the writing was really beautiful, because it closes that link for me between studio practice and kind of history and theory. And then using drawing, two of you have used drawing to think about like how one sees the statues and how the statues are formed, and those were really effective illustrations in terms of making me understand that you were really studying the forms. Somebody else made their own map. Oh yeah, here we go. This is the water fountain one on the bottom left. Somebody made their own map, one of the worst cases of 1960s urban planning in Cambridge. So this is Tony. And I really love this as well, because it's the overlaying of like the digital Google map with the handwritten notes, like saying what was around it. So really situating and communicating to a reader like why this is one of the worst cases of 1960s urban planning, and really locating it, and doing that through studio practice was really good. And then somebody else here started looking at the textures of the statue and just pulled out a couple of the textures to give me a sense, like I can't go and visit the statue or monument, but to give me a sense of like the materiality of it. And I found those to be really effective. So I just want to kind of congratulate you as a year group, because I haven't seen this kind of work before in submissions, and this for me was really, really, really great. So I would strongly recommend that closing of the gap between studio and context. Next stage. Oh yeah, this is a crucial one. Follow the brief, answer the question. Don't forget to answer the question. Some of you wrote really effectively about like the statue or monument, like the formal qualities of it, its history, why it was built, who was it built for, etc. But you didn't actually answer the question of what that statue was doing in terms of building a particular history or theory of British identity, or whichever country you're in. What, you know, like British identity. You didn't actually answer the question. You don't have to do it in like paragraphs and paragraphs. It can be a couple of sentences, but don't forget to answer the question. So that's my comment number 5. Have a conclusion, even if it's just 2 sentences. So here's an example of somebody who was concluding their work, which I thought was good. So how a society curates its war memorials is what a society wants to remember, what it wants to forget, and often creates barriers to authentic remembrance. And then it moves on to the Nelson statue and like contextualizes it. And that was just a really neat way to start ending it, like doing the big picture of like what is the proposition of a war memorial and what does it do, what society wants to remember and what it wants to forget, and then focusing in very quickly on a specific statue. Sorry, that's my dog, he's very loud. Let's go. Hang on a second, I'm just going to open the door for him. So yeah, have a conclusion, even if it's just a few sentences. Right, this is the biggie. Citations and references. Tell me from where you are getting your information. Like, where are you getting your information from? And this is the evidence point, right? This is the kind of non-negotiable point of university writing. You have to build on previous knowledge. And you have to demonstrate that you've done research, and you have to show me where you're getting your information from. So here's an example of someone who did this really, really well. It was somebody who wrote around the Rhodes statue in Oxford. So this is how you do citations and references. You see the bit where it says Oriel College 2020? Yeah, that is a citation. And at the end of the writing, there is something called a bibliography, where you note down all the sources that you used. And can you see there are 2 here? One is a BBC news story, and the other one is from Oxford History. And they've put in who the author was, the date, the full title of the article, that it was online, and also the full URL. So you can't just send to me a list of URLs. That's not sufficient. You need the full citation, you need the full reference rather in the bibliography, and then you need the citation in the text to tell me where you got your information from. I'd also like to note that this submission, the person who wrote this, used really good sources. They used the BBC News, which is a very, very valid and reliable news source, and also a local history site, Oxford History, which is run by a load of local historians. It's not like, I don't know, Vladimir Putin wrote about the Cecil Rhodes statue, where I might have some kind of hesitancy about relying on information that came from him about that subject. To think about the reliability of your sources is really, really important. So I just wanted to show you this one as an example of good practice, right? This is good practice. So make sure that you cite where you're getting your evidence from and that you have a reference. Hang on, it's my dog again. Right. So the next one is Wikipedia. Look, we all use Wikipedia, but Wikipedia is a tertiary resource, right? You have primary sources, secondary sources, tertiary sources, and Wikipedia is a tertiary source. You need to be working at the primary and secondary levels. So what this means is, whilst Wikipedia is a very good place to start, the actual material that you should be engaging with are in the sections at the bottom of the page. So this is a page on monuments from Wikipedia, and you can see the introduction and the etymology and the images. At the bottom of the page, there are references and further reading. This is an encyclopedia. So this encyclopedia is only building on knowledge that's already out there. So you need to be engaging with the material that's in the references and in the items that are under further reading, because they are the primary and secondary resources. That's where you start. That's the kind of research that you use. Please don't include Wikipedia. Like, you can use it, I'm not saying don't use it, but only as a place to start. It shouldn't be appearing in your work, because you need to be working at a higher level than Wikipedia, okay? So that's my hot take there. So have a research bibliography and cite your sources. There are a number of submissions that didn't have a research bibliography and that didn't cite any sources. And whilst they were persuasive and it was clear that the information came from somewhere, I didn't know where that came from. Like, you could have made that all up. I don't know. So you need to do those two things, please. Please, please, please ensure that you do that. Citations and a research bibliography. Finally, reflexivity. This is a key element in this, because you need to be able to reflect on your own practice. So we're trying to teach you how to become reflective practitioners, which is why we give you this group feedback for this course, because we're giving you tips and tricks to take back into your own practice and think, did I do that? Do I do this? How do I do this as different to so and so and so and so? So I'm just going to read you the quote. When a practitioner reflects in and on his practice, the possible objects of his reflection are as varied as the kinds of phenomena before him and the systems of knowing in practice that he brings to them. He may reflect on the tacit norms and appreciations that underlie a judgment, or on the strategies and theories implicit in a pattern of behaviour. He may reflect on the feeling for a situation that has led him to adopt a particular course of action, on the way in which he has framed the problem he is trying to solve, or on the role he has constructed for himself within a larger institutional context. This quote for me is super important in a whole number of different ways, because it's giving you various ways in which you can become a reflective practitioner. And one of them, and I think this ties back to the openings, is that some of the most effective openings were people reflecting on the experience of engaging with a monument or statue, of like, 1960s urban planning and a statue called Tony, you know, like, or someone describing the statue and then going, actually, the more interesting thing is not the statue itself, but how people are reacting to it. So those were really strong examples of people being like reflective practitioners and doing that through writing. So I just wanted to encourage you to do that. And then lastly, images. Lots of you used images, but some of you didn't. And I think if you're working on a piece of writing that's to do with objects or monuments, images can really help in the communication of ideas and meanings. They let your reader see the object that you're looking at. And obviously the way you frame it will frame the discourse that you're engaging with, because photographs are biased documents as ever, but it's really, really good to include images in your work. It doesn't just have to be a dry piece of text. So I would encourage you to use images, because some of you use them so powerfully. It was really, really great to read that, especially when you've only got 500 words. And then lastly, I've included the kind of quality descriptors that we grade on when we look at context. So this I'm giving to you as a way for you to like print it out, maybe sit down with your writing and grade yourself and go like, actually, where am I on this? Like if you're interested in like achieving and looking at how we assess work, one way to do that is to sit with your own work and grade it with our quality descriptors and say, actually, am I doing research at an exceptional level that reaches a professional standard, or is my work legible and understandable, but the ideas are not always communicated in a clear and concise fashion? And like really start assessing yourself and thinking, actually, I'm not so good at this bit. This is the bit of my work I need to develop, or I'm really good at this bit, but I could actually do a bit more over here. And it, again, this is a tool for you to use as kind of reflective practitioners. So I wanted to give that to you. I haven't put these feedback slides up yet. I will put them on the VLE and I will put them into our Teams channel so that you can go back and you can look at them. But that essentially is my feedback to you. So I'm going to stop sharing this and say, does anyone have any questions for me? Does that make sense? Any questions?
Question from Stefano, actually.
Hello, Stefano.
Oh, do I have to put my camera on? Oh,
you don't have to. You just ask me.
Oh, there we go. I wanted to ask about the next project that we have, the next piece of writing that we do. Will you be talking about that next week? When will you explain a bit more about that, please?
Yes, so that is going to be explained by Toby next week. Honestly, Stefano, it's brilliant to see your face, because I haven't seen you all term and I'm really liking seeing you. So that's super nice. Sorry, I diverted. Toby is going to present it next week. Essentially, what we will ask you to do is take the piece of writing you did for him and the piece of writing you did for me and put them together, and then write a third piece at the end that ties them together. But we're going to present that next week. So that won't be due in. That's your summative assessment, and that won't be due in until after the Easter holiday. So Elizabeth, I think that answers your question as well. Yeah? Elizabeth. Thank you, Stefano.
Thank you so much.
Elizabeth? Yeah? Okay, so Toby will introduce that. Next week is our last session for Histories and Theories, which is very sad because I have really enjoyed teaching you, even under these super weird conditions. But hopefully things will start opening up soon and we can do more face-to-face conversations. But yeah, Toby will present it next week, but don't stress about it now, not worth it. Yeah, just like read the material I've put up for you, have a think about the politics of the everyday, maybe make an inflatable cobblestone, like go and have some fun. Okay, any other comments for me about the feedback? Thanks, Ellen. And the highlight of a Wednesday. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. There are other highlights. But I've got the Wednesday. I feel honoured. Thank you. Any other comments? Does everyone understand it? Well, on that note then, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to bid you farewell and wish you the very best of Wednesdays. I'll upload the files this afternoon. I'm just going to go for a walk with the dog and then I'll upload the files. But as ever, a super pleasure to be with you today. And I will see you next week with Toby. So have good days. I'm going to stop recording. Stop.
Thank you.
Thank you.